The sun was sinking low in the Sacramento sky, casting a smoky haze over the city streets. As Eric Porter drove home from a long day at the office, he gazed at the vibrant hues of orange and gold that danced across the horizon. The light was soft, yet it masked the tension that lingered in the air. Unbeknownst to him, fate was about to take a sharp turn. As Eric neared an intersection, he found himself in a familiar ritual, smoothing his blazer, tapping the steering wheel to the rhythm of an unremarkable tune on the radio. His mind wandered through the events of the day, reviewing meetings and deadlines, when suddenly, the comforting glow of the yellow light flickered to red. Not tonight, he muttered to himself, easing on the brakes and coming to a halt just as the blare of sirens erupted behind him. Blue and red lights flashed, piercing through the evening twilight like a beacon of authority. Great. Just great, Eric sighed, pulling over to the side of the road. He rolled down his window slightly, his brow furrowing as Officer Bradley Larson, an officer in his mid-30s with a buzz cut and an air of unwarranted confidence, stepped out of his patrol car. License and registration, Larson barked, an edge of impatience laced with authority in his voice. Eric nodded and complied, reaching into his glove compartment with deliberate calmness. His heart raced not out of fear, but anticipation. This was a familiar dance he had endured too many times before. He handed over the documents and shifted in his seat, meeting the officer's gaze head-on. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Larson asked, leaning in closer, his expression a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "Not entirely sure," Eric replied evenly. "Perhaps for not coming to a complete stop at the light?" Larson didn't respond immediately. Instead, he scrutinized Eric, his eyes darting to the tailored suit and polished shoes as if deducing something. "You don't seem like you're from around here," he said, his voice tinged with condescension. "I moved here a few months ago," Eric offered, trying to maintain an air of politeness, though he could sense the undertones in Larson's tone, a hint that he was already judging him on superficial grounds. The air thickened with tension, and Eric could feel Larson's assumptions bubble beneath the surface, like smoke rising from a fire. The officer stewed in his thoughts, clearly deciding that a simple traffic stop would not suffice. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" Larson probed, his posture shifting as if preparing for something more. "Just going home, officer," Eric replied, but he knew the conversation had shifted. Larson was no longer interested in a minor infraction, he was searching for something deeper. Eric recognized the power play at hand. The officer had already donned the cloak of authority, and he was determined to wield it. "Step out of the car for me." The command was sharper, almost a threat. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" Eric's grip on the steering wheel tightened, but he kept his face neutral, a mask of control in the chaotic dance they were engaging in. Larson's jaw tightened. "I asked you to step out. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." With a slow exhale, Eric unbuckled his seatbelt. "Sure. I'll step out, but I'd like to understand the rationale behind it." As he stepped onto the asphalt, a subtle shift occurred. Larson, who had been positioned as the alpha in this encounter, took a step back, assessing Eric once more. The officer ordered him to turn around and place his hands on the hood of the car while the tension crackled like static electricity in the air. "Do you seriously think I'm hiding something?" Eric challenged, his tone measured. "Just routine," Larson shot back, pacing like a wounded animal, his authority in question. The distance between them shrank as Larson approached, patting Eric down with movements that felt rough and excessive. It was more an assertion of dominance than anything else. But Eric remained unfazed, his calm demeanor appeared to unsettle Larson even further. "You're clean," Larson muttered, stepping back in a huff, his irritation simmering at the surface. "Of course I am," Eric replied coolly. "But this isn't merely a traffic stop anymore, is it?" The officer's confidence shuddered slightly as he stumbled through the words, struggling to regain control of the conversation. "You seem to know a lot about how these interactions work," Larson accused, his hand inching toward his belt. Eric narrowed his eyes, the moment hanging heavy between them. "I believe in transparency," he challenged, lifting an eyebrow. "Maybe you should, too." Larson's face soured with frustration, but Eric's unyielding stance took him by surprise. He wasn't the typical driver who cowered under pressure. This was a man who stood tall in the face of authority. The smoke of assumption and bias thickened in the air, wrapping them in a tense standoff. "You think you're smarter than me?" Larson barked, leaning in. But something shifted. The officer finally saw that he was potentially facing a challenger. "No," Eric replied, his tone calm and firm. "But I am seeking respect. And so far, I don't see much of that from you." The silence between them was a tempest, a smoldering battle of wills. Larson recoiled slightly, the last shred of bravado wavering as he realized that Eric wasn't the average civilian he was used to. "Watch your tone," Larson finally retorted, but there was less edge in his voice now, a diminution collapsing within his posture. "What I'm finding most troubling," Eric pressed, "is that you've pigeonholed me based on a suit and a sedan. It's not about this interaction anymore, is it?" Larson bristled, the metaphorical smoke mirrors around him started to dissipate, leaving only the raw truth, still too painful to confront. "People like you, always," he began, but the words hung in the air unfinished, toxic yet revealing. "I think I know what you mean," Eric interjected quietly, his calm demeanor was piercing, a blade cutting through the pretense. The real test was only beginning as Eric's voice took a daring turn. "Let me remind you, Officer Larson, there's more to me than what you've assumed." Larson's eyes narrowed, and Eric pulled out a leather wallet slowly, revealing his badge. "This is who I am," he proclaimed steadily. "Head of Internal Affairs." The officer's demeanor crumbled like ash falling to the ground, disbelief painting his features. "Internal Affairs?" Larson echoed, his voice shaking. Eric straightened. "Yes. I'm your worst nightmare, officer. I oversee officer conduct, ensuring integrity and respect in law enforcement. And your assumptions today? They'll have consequences." For the first time, Larson stood utterly speechless, his facade shattered as realization dawned on him like a cruel winter morning. Eric advanced, using the power of his position wisely. "The most troubling part of this interaction," Eric said, pausing to let the weight of each word sink in, "is that I don't fit your idea of what a law-abiding citizen should look like." He stepped back, allowing Larson a breath, letting the trembling officer grasp the reality of his actions. "You thought I would cower under your scrutiny, but I'm not just another driver, I'm here to hold you accountable." The silence roared between them, a tempest brewing inside Larson's mind. He had crossed a line, and now stood trapped. "Here's what's going to happen," Eric said finally. "You will return my documents and reflect on what just occurred." Hand shaking, Larson reached into his pocket, fished out the license and registration, and handed them over, realizing that he was severing the thread of power he had so arrogantly wielded moments ago. Eric accepted them, his calm demeanor unwavering, but as he turned to his car, he didn't forget the officer standing behind him, conflicted, frazzled, possibly frightened. "Remember this day, Officer Larson," he said, his voice echoing out into the fading light. "The badge doesn't elevate you, it binds you to accountability." As Eric drove away, the silence in his car felt different. It was tranquil, yet it pulsed with electric energy, a promise of change. The encounter replayed vividly in his mind, but this time, instead of dread, he felt the strength of purpose swelling within him, the determination igniting a fire that could not be extinguished. The next morning dawned bright and clear as Eric sat at his desk within the walls of the Internal Affairs Division. A file sat open before him, Officer Bradley Larson. Eric leaned back, surveying the case with a careful gaze. He was not just looking at a troublesome officer, he was staring at the very problem that plagued the police force, a culture that enabled bias, assumptions, and unchecked authority. It was time for a shift, a systematic overhaul. Eric summoned his assistant, Linda, as thoughts turned into actions. "Can you set up a meeting with Chief Daniels?" he requested, urgency lacing his tone. "There's something crucial we need to discuss." Throughout the morning, the wheels of change began to turn. As Eric compiled reports and documents, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It was a new day for accountability. Later, he found himself seated across from Chief Daniels, the tension of the moment heavy in the air. "Eric, what's going on?" Daniels asked, his features marked by curiosity. "I had an interaction with Officer Larson that's troubling, to say the least. This isn't just a minor incident, it reflects a deeper issue within the department," Eric stated firmly. "Larson? What's he done this time?" Daniels inquired. Eric described the traffic stop in detail, emphasizing Larsen's unwarranted assumptions and how this encounter wasn't an anomaly but rather a symptom of a culture that needed re-evaluation. His actions are indicative of a larger issue, Eric pressed. We need to conduct a department-wide review, overhaul our training protocols, and ensure we're held to a higher standard. Daniels rubbed his temples, thought processes visibly at work. It won't be easy. You know this could ruffle some feathers. Good, Eric replied. It's about time someone did. We can't just brush these issues under the rug. The days turned into weeks as Eric led the charge for change, igniting discussions in the department that had long been absent. He gathered data, held community forums, and harvested voices that needed to be heard. The department faced both pushback and support, but Eric understood this battle was for a greater purpose. Finally, the day arrived when the community convened for a discussion of accountability, justice, and reform. Eric stood before a crowd of officers, citizens, and officials alike, heart-pounding with anticipation. Justice isn't merely about action. It's about ensuring those who serve do so with integrity and respect for every citizen, he proclaimed, his voice burning with passion. We stand together to reshape this department and restore trust in our community. As applause surged through the room, Eric felt a swell of pride. He watched Larsen sit amidst the crowd, reflecting on the consequences of his actions. This wasn't just about personal transformation, it was about crafting a future where respect became the cornerstone of law enforcement. Months rolled by, but Eric's journey was far from over. Each meeting, each conversation fueled a movement that grew with every citizen willing to share their story. As Eric stepped away from the podium, he turned to face the crowd. Caught in the sea of faces, some hopeful, some cautious, he felt a renewed sense of responsibility. Change would not come overnight, but together, the community would rise, holding both the badge and the bearer accountable. And thus began a new chapter for Sacramento, a story etched in resilience, purpose, and accountability forever brightened by one moment of confrontation that had ignited the embers of change.